We had a, I'm not sure if it was a gift or a long-term loan of the, it even has a display case, the Olympus XA, which is a camera from my, I wouldn't say my childhood, from my youth. Well, I started in 1979, so yeah, I was pretty young when they first came out. It's sort of the beginning of the compact point-and-shoot camera world. This camera was not necessarily the first one, but it was a Minox, I think, probably was the very first ultra-compact 35mm camera, and even smaller sub-miniature. But Olympus, this was one of the cameras along with the, and then there's a whole line of them after this. There was the Nikon 35 and 28 Ti, there were the Yashica T, 2, 3, 4, 5s, T5, anyway. And a whole bunch of other manufacturers all came up with their relatively small, compact 35mm cameras. And then in later years, of course, they had AF on them and they had a whole bunch of other stuff. Well, I didn't really know anything about it. I've seen them forever. For the last little while, I had a number of photographers that I really respect tell me that they loved this camera. And lo and behold, one of them showed up and I thought, I gotta try this thing out. And I always felt that it was, well, kind of cheap and not really worthwhile, almost a bit of a gimmick, and not quite as much of a gimmick as, say, a Holga or a Diana or something like that, but really just not worthy of a lot of serious consideration. But then I thought, before I shoot my mouth off yet again, I should give it a try and see whether or not I'm right. And lo and behold, as you'll find out, no, I wasn't right. It's an amazing little camera. So, starting with the camera itself, this one comes with the A11 flash, which is integrated in the camera in a very, fairly straightforward way, but it only has room for one AA battery, so you don't really get a lot of oomph out of that flash, and I'm not a big fan of the flash anyway, so we just take it off for now, put it aside, and there's your XA. So, working your way through the camera, start with the lens. It's an F Zuiko, Z-U-I-K-O. I'm not sure if there's an A through E Zuiko, but this is an F Zuiko. I couldn't really find too much information about it. It's apparently a fairly simple 35mm f2.8 lens, made in Japan. It says so on the front there too. Olympus for years was right at the forefront of small, high-quality optics, and this lens is no, there's no slouch. It, like all lenses, well, not like all lenses, like many lenses of this era, corners are a bit mushy at f2.8, and but of course, like all lenses, once you stop down to f5.6 or f8, it's pretty nice and not too contrasty, doesn't flare too much, and is not that sharp, but that's not a bad thing. One of the things that I really struggle with, especially with modern optics, is how shrill and how clinical a lot of lenses can be, and how, and how, yes, it's sharp, but it also doesn't really have much in the way of character or interest or mojo. It just is sharp. So, and this lens has character and interest and mojo, and is adequately sharp. And also, the other thing about this camera or this lens that I really like is that it renders out of focus items rather nicely. Fall off is nice, and it's quite sympathetic. What's the word? It's a kind lens, shall we say. One of the things I don't really care about it, and actually it's kind of surprising, is it only has a 4-bladed aperture. So you get this, there's your aperture, as opposed to 8 or 11 or 9-bladed apertures on other lenses, which makes for often weird bokeh in the background, but not displeasing, not ugly, just sort of different. You actually have Rangefinder Focus coupled. Earlier cameras would have a rangefinder, which you could use, and then you would get a distance in your rangefinder that then you would then use to set your camera to the right distance. So they weren't coupled, it was uncoupled. So this is actually a coupled rangefinder. ISO ranging from, or ASA ranging from 25 to 800. Viewfinder is like any viewfinder out of a early 1980s point-and-shoot camera. Pretty forgettable. There is, however, on the left-hand side, there is a shutter speed metering on this camera, aperture priority only. So you set your ISO, you set your aperture, and you shoot. And it just gives you shutter speed. Now, on the bottom of the camera, you have a switch that gives you plus 1.5 stops if your subject is fairly backlit. There's a battery check, and then the last one is a self-timer. So fun little switch on the bottom there. So you can alter the exposure, depending on using that switch, or you can alter the exposure using different settings in your ASA dial. But the viewfinder also has has frame lines, which I'm not entirely sure just how much of the frame they show. I haven't actually done any major testing, but it's a good it's a good approximation of what you're going to get. And of course, in the middle is your rangefinder patch, which only really works if you're looking right square at the viewfinder. I went through a situation where I was wearing a pair of gloves, and it had pushed the camera a little tiny bit to one side, and all of a sudden the shutter speed disappeared and I couldn't focus. So your eye eye point needs to be right smack in the middle of the rangefinder window. Otherwise, you're not gonna get much at all. And I don't know how it works with glasses. I don't wear glasses, although I probably should. And but I was okay with my bare eyes focusing it. You open it up and you turn it on, and that's the on-off switch. It does take 2 button cell batteries, and it's pretty straightforward. You load it up just like that, and it has the Film Advance wheel. Reminds me of one of those disposable cameras that we all had as kids. There's not a lot of metal in this camera. The rails are plastic. The takeoff spool is plastic. The pressure plate is metal, and a nice metal spring. So that's nice. So at least hopefully you get film held nice and tight against the rails. But it is a little too plasticky for my personal taste. But given that they were going for an inexpensive, and basically this is sort of an inexpensive, it's a rangefinder camera, just like an M6, or an M, at the time, I guess, an M4? So it's understandable that they would have to make a few compromises on construction in order to come up with something that works, for the price point they were going for. But it is it's interesting, right? I mean, like you look at the design of the camera. There's no sharp edges on it, so it will slide in and out of a pocket really easily. And of course, also there's no sharp edges on it, so it's kind of hard to grip. Especially if I don't have very big hands. I've got actually fairly small hands, relatively speaking. But I found that I really struggled with worrying about dropping it. Now there's a little, I don't know if you can see that little hole there on the end that you use to take the pin out if you want to change the light seals. You may or may not have seen our change the light seals on this camera video. But what you can also do is you can thread through a little wrist strap, which I think is, if I was going to shoot with this any more than I have already, it is essential. Otherwise, you're just going to drop the camera. It's just too small. So, so there's that. And then now, what do I like about it? I like how small it is. I like how relatively inexpensive it is. I like that f2.8 lens. I like that you can focus with the rangefinder. The later versions of this camera were all zone focus. You would just sort of guess your focus, not unlike if you were shooting, with a Holga or with an older camera, like what I mentioned before. I like how, actually, if you're careful, what you can do is, because it's so small, you can, if you thread your film in carefully and just like shut the door and start shooting, you can get like 40 frames out of a roll of 36, which is kind of fun. But then you need to make sure that you don't put anything really important at the beginning or the end, because as happened to me, the lab, well, I mean, like, it wasn't their fault. They just cut the film and stuck a sticker on it, and that was the last frame of my roll, had a big sticker on it and was sliced. But part of the thrill, I guess, of getting as many frames as you can. Things that I don't like about it is the shutter button is super, like, hair trigger. And when the camera's open, if you touch that button, you're taking a photo. And I mean, the benefit is, of course, is that you don't have to give it much pressure in order to take a photo. The drawback is you take photos, lots of self-portraits and photos of skies and feet and stuff like that. I mean, I would like a little more feedback on the shutter button, but I understand why they did it that way, because I guess they didn't want it to catch on anything. That's the other thing as well, is that if you're not paying attention, you can actually get the edges of or let me rephrase that. When I wasn't paying attention, I was getting the edges of my fingers in a couple of frames. It's my own fault. but anyway, but it's small, it's light, it's compact, it's a known quantity. These things are great. There's not a whole lot that can go wrong with them, I don't think. You can buy foam seals if the foam seals have died on the internet, and you can drop them in, which is not too hard. And it's a great little unit. I mean, like there's really nothing to it except that it's. I mean, it's funny. It's not unlike the D500 that I was talking about earlier. Is that you don't ask from it what it can't give you, but what it does very well. Whoever designed this really thought about everything that was within their control. They thought about it and they made it work as best they could given the circumstances. And I don't have anything to say. I would love if the image quality was a bit sharper, especially in the corners, especially at 2.8. It's not too contrasty. It's the meter actually is surprisingly good. Especially, I shot a roll of chrome film with it recently, and the slides were, properly exposed, which was really nice. And even shooting on a bright, contrasty winter light, I was just doing some street photography, which apparently this camera is great for, which I am not very good at, but whatever, practice. The exposures were really good, and so for again for what it is and what it does really well. I wouldn't want to drop it. I don't think it would survive any kind of impact with any sort of with any success. But short of that, it's a fun little camera. Talk about a few frames that I scanned in. Well, one of the things that I did find with this camera is, for whatever reason, my film got scratched. Portraits with 35mm, it's a bit wide for portraits. As long as you step back, it does some lovely. Lovely sympathetic portraits, even the ones that are out of focus. Of course, it also helps to have a subject who enjoys being photographed. The lines are pretty straight when you're shooting architecture, especially at the edges and the corners. There's not a lot of fall off, but there is some vignetting, especially if you're shooting on a bright day. You look at blue skies, you see a little bit of vignetting in the corners, which can be challenging. Just thinking about some of the black and white images that I shot, the lens is pretty low contrast, which is a good thing for this lens, but I did find that I was adding a bit of contrast to some of my images just to make them a bit more snappy, but that's more of a personal preference thing than anything else, I think. Lots of them around, and I think they're, I don't know, well, my understanding is they're between $200 and $400. So, go and get one. Put a roll of film into it, shoot it, and enjoy.